All right, let us continue. We concluded that reality is entirely unknowable. I may say in the last part of the critique, after having established space, time, and the categories, Kant spends an enormous number of pages taking every aspect of reality which preceding philosophers had thought you could know something about in reason, and trying to demonstrate in each particular case that you could not acquire such knowledge. He sets himself to prove, and of course on the basis of what he has said in the first part of the critique, he's able to do so without difficulty. He sets himself to prove that you can't know anything about the self in itself. That is to say, about human consciousness in itself, because, of course, we have to think in terms of our a priori concepts, and that debars us from access to reality. You can't know anything about God. He then takes on the traditional proofs of the existence of God, which philosophers for hundreds and thousands of years have put forth, and blasts each one with relish, showing that they make use of the a priori concepts, and therefore the categories, and therefore those proofs are invalid. Obviously, for instance, you couldn't prove there's a God via the argument that, well, God must be the substance who created or caused the world, because substance, cause, etc. are all simply categories and inapplicable, and therefore God is unknowable in reason. He claims to prove we can't know anything about the universe as a whole, whether it's finite, infinite, and that any time we try to reason about the universe as a whole, we simply end up in grotesque contradictions, which he claims to specify. The conclusion he comes to is we have to restrict all knowledge exclusively, all rational knowledge, all knowledge involving concepts and sense experience, all that is restricted to the phenomenal world. Well, you might ask, do we have any kind of access of any sort to the noumenal world? And the answer, which may or may not surprise you, is yes, we do have a way of getting a glimmer. But that way is not by means of reason. It comes via ethics, of all things. If you understand ethics properly, we will see the lead to the noumenal world. So let us then look at Kant's ethics and climax it with the insight it gives us into the noumenal world. So if you're making notes now, call it Kant's ethics. Prior to Kant, in the history of philosophy, there were two basic approaches to ethics. On the one hand, there was a whole group of philosophers who had claimed that you could establish moral judgments as absolute, objective, certain. They thought that you could establish, for instance, men ought to tell the truth, they ought to respect human life, you ought to keep your promises, it's wrong to kill an innocent man, etc. They were the absolutists in ethics. But prior to Kant, they were all anti-empirical. They did not think you could base ethics on experience. If you ask these philosophers, well, how do you validate your absolute ethical judgments? They gave you a variety of answers. For instance, Plato would have said, you have a recollection or reminiscence of what goodness is from your sojourn in a preceding life. Or Augustine, speaking for the Christians, would say, God gives you the revelations. Many of the modern rationalists said we were born with certain innate moral ideas which constitute the basis of an absolute objective ethics. In all these cases, these people believed in effect in a special intuitive faculty to let you know what's right or wrong, independent of sense experience. Now, Kant rejects this approach as mystical, arbitrary, irrational. He agrees with the goal of these philosophers. That is, he agrees that ethics should be a matter of absolute objective principles that can be demonstrated, but he doesn't think that appeals to reminiscence, revelation, innate ideas, etc., is acceptable. Well, the other school in ethics prior to Kant had been the empiricists. We're born tabula rasa. All knowledge, they claim, comes from experience. And therefore, all ethical knowledge has to come from experience. But of course, that confronted them with the question, how? How could we get ethical knowledge simply from observing the facts of experience? Hume claimed to reach a dead end at this point. Remember, I think we mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. How can you get an ought from an is? All we observe and experience is what things are, what people actually do. We can't observe an ought, taste a should, touch a desirability. We can't sense evaluations, and therefore how can we get them from experience? Well, what the empiricists had attempted to do to get around this, in effect, is to observe that human beings pursue various goals. And they differed as to what they thought the goals of human beings were, but they thought you could observe, as a matter of fact, that human beings do pursue various goals. And then morality for them would be a matter of prescribing the means of achieving these goals. The function of morality, according to the empiricists, was simply to tell you, if you want to achieve a certain end, then this is how to behave to get it. So Aristotle, for instance, said all men want happiness, and then proceeded in his ethics to outline the conditions of how to achieve happiness. Epicurus said all men want pleasure, and proceeded to outline his particular version of how to experience, how to achieve pleasure. The hope that the empiricists had for an objective ethics was, in effect, to find some one goal that all men, as a matter of fact, wanted, and then tell people how to get it. Well, will this do as an approach to an objective ethics? Kant's answer is no. Because he says the problem that the empiricists are confronted with is how do you validate the basic goal, the ultimate value? The basic goal constitutes the standard of value by reference to which all other values are validated. If you knew what your ultimate end was to be and you could prove that, it's comparatively easy to figure out the means of achieving it. But the question for the empiricist school is, how do they know what the ultimate end, the final, ultimate goal of human action should be? Should men pursue happiness or pleasure or the welfare of others or life or what? Now, the only answer of the empiricists prior to this period was, well, we just simply have to observe the ultimate goals that people actually do pursue. That has to be our standard. We can't observe an ought, so we're reduced to saying whatever ultimate goals, as a matter of fact, people pursue, that's where we start. That's all we can observe. Now Kant objects to that proposal, that way of approaching the construction of an ethics on perfectly valid grounds. He says either men have a choice about their basic goals or they don't. If they don't have any choice about their basic goals, that means they're determined. They have no control over their behavior, and consequently, no ethics is necessary or possible. If their basic motivation is set by their nature, and that dictates everything else, then they're outside the province of ethics, and we don't need ethics. If they do have a choice about their basic goals, and that's the precondition of discussing ethics, then the fact that everybody does, as a matter of fact, pursue a certain goal is irrelevant. Because the question of ethics, he says, is not what goals do men pursue, but what goals should they pursue. The empiricists seem to have no answer to this problem. No way to solve it just by observing men and their actions. And the result was that empiricist ethics always tended to subjectivism, says Kant. The empiricists said, in effect, granted you aim at X, whatever that goal happens to be, then so-and-so is how you should live. But if a man came back to them and said, why should I aim at X? I don't want it. Prove to me that X ought to be my basic value. The empiricists in the last analysis were helpless. They couldn't validate the basic goal. Now we can put this same point in Kant's terminology. An empirical approach to ethics, he says, in other words, an approach which would be based simply on facts of experience, gives us only what he calls hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives. An imperative means simply a statement to act a certain way, an injunction to action. A hypothetical imperative is an imperative of the form, if you want something, then do something. Hypothetical, we know, means simply if-then in form. And his point is that an empiricist can tell a man, if you want happiness, if you want success, if you want life, whatever the X is that he happens to pick, then do this, do that, etc. But he can't establish that the man ought to want the particular X. And the result, says Kant, is subjectivism. Anything goes. If the Nazis came on the scene, of course Kant didn't refer to them, but if the Nazis came on the scene, and they could just as well say, if you want the triumph of the Aryan race and the destruction of the Jews, then you should build concentration camps and mobilize the Wehrmacht, and etc., and so on. And apparently, that would be in no better or worse position than any others, because everybody simply starts with arbitrarily, if you want it, then do so-and-so. In other words, a hypothetical imperative, an imperative which tells you if you want to achieve a certain goal, do such and such, leads to subjectivism because there's no way to validate the basic goal. This is Kant's view. Well, what conclusion can we come to from this, he says? We have to abandon the idea that ethics prescribes means to achieving some end, because there's no way to validate an ultimate end. If ethics is to be absolute, objective, universally binding, if we're not to get bogged down in subjectivism, then moral rules can't be of the form, if you want to achieve such and such a goal, do this. Moral rules must not be in the form of hypothetical imperatives, but what he calls categorical imperatives. A categorical imperative has no reference to a goal in it. It has no if part to it. It simply says, this is what you ought to do, period. Not if you want to achieve happiness or the welfare of mankind or anything at all. Simply, this act is right and do it, period. And for Kant, if we're to have an objective ethics, it must be comprised of categorical imperatives. Moral laws must declare, in effect, certain actions are right in themselves, regardless of anybody's goals, anybody's purposes, anybody's desires, regardless of what they lead to, regardless of what their consequences are. Certain actions are simply right. And a categorical imperative is going to be a statement that tells us such and such a type of action is simply right, and you must do it, regardless of your desires, goals, regardless of the consequences. We have to then abandon the idea that morality is a means to an end. We have to abandon the idea that virtues are justified on the grounds of the values they lead to. Morality is no longer going to be a guide as to how to achieve some particular goal, how to gain some advantage, how to attain some result. It's going to be a series of categorical rules which it is simply our duty to obey because they're right in themselves, period. Now what we want to do is find out what are these categorical imperatives. Could we learn them from experience? Obviously not, because here Kant agrees with Hume. Can't experience what ought to be or what's right. You can only experience what is the case. We need to discover a moral law telling us that such and such, we haven't yet established what, is what ought to occur, and yet we can't get such a law by studying the world. Now, of course, if we could follow the Christian pattern, we would be okay, because God gave a series of at least 10 categorical imperatives, which we call the 10 Commandments to the Christians. And notice those are categorical imperatives. God doesn't say, thou shalt not kill if thy goal is the preservation of mankind and the achievement of human happiness, etc. He doesn't say, thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother because it'll lead to this result. He just says, do it, period. There's no footnotes, no etc. Now, those are simply categorical imperatives, outright commandments that you must obey. And that's what Kant is looking for in ethics, for the reason I mentioned, but of course he can't get it straight from God because God is unknowable on his system. Well, what is his solution? How is he going to find the categorical imperative? Well, I don't think it should be too difficult for you to guess his solution, because we've been in this type of situation before. If you recall, we needed a number of laws telling us what has to occur. For instance, that there must be cause and effect, there must be entities, etc. And we couldn't get them from experience. And you remember Kant's solution. If you need a certain type of law, and you can't find that law in the world on the basis of experience, try the Copernican revolution. Try reversing the situation completely. And therefore, just as we said with causality, it's part of the structure of the mind. We bring it to the world. Let's do the same thing on the moral level. Just as our minds put together the noumenal data in various ways, with the result that we all necessarily think in terms of causality, substance, unity, and so on, well, let's say the same type of thing on the moral level. Let us say that our minds, on the moral or practical level, put together the noumenal data, process it pre-consciously, with the result that all of us necessarily, universally experience the sense that certain things categorically ought to be done, period. So you can think of it, in effect, although he doesn't use any terms like this, as though, in addition to everything we've had so far built into us, there's a moral filter, in effect, on the order of the causal filter and the space filter. And after the data from the noumenal world goes through, we get the sense certain actions are obligatory. It's my duty to do them. It is what I ought to do. Just as causality is contributed by the a priori structure of the mind, so is morality. Well, do we have any proof that there is such a moral filter operating? Well, says Kant, yes, we do. Because he says we all have the sense that there are certain things we ought to do. And that that's certainly not the same as simply what we want to do. You can know, for instance, I want to do X, but I shouldn't. I want to watch television, but I shouldn't. I should be studying. Or you can know, I don't want X. I don't want to study, but I should. I ought to. We all have the sense, he says, that apart from any of our desires, wishes, hopes, etc., there are certain obligations we have. And yet, of course, how could we account for this sense that there are things we ought to do, that there are binding moral principles on us, if we had to rely strictly on experience? You couldn't get that ought, but we've got it. And therefore, the source of that ought, of the moral laws it requires, must be within, must be in the structure of the mind. It must be the case, then, that certain moral commandments are built into the structure of our minds, that our own minds on this deepest noumenal level issue to us certain moral orders, certain commandments, so that after a certain processing, which is, by the way, the same for everybody, unconscious, universal, we all have the sense this is what we ought to do. There's, in fact, one such law built in, which is the categorical imperative with a capital C and a capital I. And if we can find that, we will then know how we should act and have solved the problem of morality. So the question is, what is the moral commandment issued to us a priori by our own minds? What does our moral filter, in effect, order us to do? Now notice that it has to be very, very general, because it's something that's given to us a priori, independent of experience. So it couldn't be that we're born with, for instance, the commandment or the categorical imperative, don't rob banks, or always be nice to people. We couldn't be born with any such things because banks, people, nice, etc., are all concepts that depend on experience. Those are empirical concepts. And the categorical imperative we're looking for is a priori, built into the structure of the mind. Therefore, it has to be an enormously general type of principle, the most abstract kind of moral law. And the idea will be first we discover it, and then, by a process of reasoning, we can, using it as our foundation, apply it to a variety of particular cases and deduce what our specific duties are in a whole variety of specific situations. So it's a very much parallel to his view on causality. We're born only with the general concept of cause and effect, but if you want a specific causal law, you have to study the facts as given in experience. Similarly, we're given this very abstract moral commandment, which I'll tell you in a moment, and then we learn to apply it as we acquire experience. Well, what could this abstract moral commandment be? Well, we start with the fact that there are things we ought to do. And if we only could analyze that sense we take for granted everybody has, that sense of obligation, things you ought to do. We don't know yet what they are, but we're going to start with that sense. And simply by analyzing what's involved in saying there's things we ought to do, we're going to arrive at what's the categorical imperative that we're looking for. What does it mean to say you ought to do X? Tell the truth, whatever it happens to be. Well, obviously it means, regardless of your personal feelings, your preferences, your wishes, your hopes, your fears, you ought to do it. This is something that's binding on you, not because of anything particular to you, your desires, etc., but simply because you're a human being, which means it's going to have to be applicable to all human beings. If there's something you ought to do, you ought to do it, regardless of your feelings. What Kant is getting at here is he's opposed to people who try to make an exception of themselves to a moral rule that they otherwise recognize. There is a sort of person who says, for instance, yes, people ought to tell the truth, but I don't want to in this particular case, so I'm going to make myself an exception to the general moral rule. Now, this is what he's opposed to. He's saying, in effect, if people should do something, then so should you. Inherent in saying that men have a sense there are things they ought to do is that anyone's personal feelings, desires, etc., is irrelevant. If something's a moral law, it is then a law applicable to everyone. No one then is justified in cheating on it or expecting other people to follow it while he breaks it. Now, we put the same thing another way and simply say a moral law must be universalizable. You take in that mouthful, universalizable. In other words, must be such that it could serve as a principle of action for all men. For all men. And that is actually all we know, a priori. That is the categorical imperative. I'll dictate to you a rather archaically worded English translation of the categorical imperative, since it's so famous you may want to take it down. It is act only on that maxim whereby, I'll read it once first and then go slower. Act only on that maxim whereby thou canst at the same time will that it should become a universal law. I'll say it slower. That's the categorical imperative. Act only on that maxim whereby thou canst. You can write you can if you think that would be preferable. At the same time will that it should become a universal law. Or another formulation he gives of it is, act as if the maxim of thy action were to become by thy will a universal law of nature. And commentators sometimes give this example, this elaboration to explain what he means. Before you undertake an action, identify the principle underlying your action. And then imagine that the fact that you took the action has a hypnotic effect on the totality of mankind, on every other human being, so that thereafter, in all cases and permanently, without exception, every human being will act on the principle you just acted. If you can, it's a possible state of affairs. If it's truly possible for everyone, without exception, all the time, to act on that principle, then it qualifies as universalizable. And that means it's perfectly fine, the categorical imperative is all in favor of it. On the other hand, if it's a type of action which absolutely could not be universalized, in order to be put into practice, it requires a contradiction. It requires some people to live by it, while other people violate it. Then it's non-universalizable, it's evil, you mustn't perform it. So you can think of that hypnotic test, so to speak. You have hypnotic power over all mankind, and the principle is it possible to universalize your action? That's all the mind tells us a priori. It tells us, in effect, conform your behavior to universalizable laws. Now we're armed with this principle. We simply go through the various situations in life, trying to figure out whether any particular principle is or is not universalizable. If it is, fine. If it isn't, it's immoral. Now, I'll give you a crude, simple example of a principle that no one ever put forth, but just to illustrate this, that would not be universalizable and therefore would be out. Suppose someone in a bizarre frame of mind should advance the following moral principle. Never buy a newspaper, always read somebody else's. Now you'd say right away, well, that just could not be universalized. In logic, it would be contradictory. Because if nobody bought a newspaper, there'd be nobody else's to read. The only way that you could possibly act on this advice is if somebody violates it and buys his own newspaper, and then you're counting on him to have one in order to not buy one yourself. That clearly would not be universalized. Now, do we have any more significant consequences from this principle? Because hopefully we do. And Kant thinks there's many, many crucial virtues he can prove simply by application of this principle. I'll give you one which is, without any controversy, the most plausible. Lying. Kant thinks he can prove that lying is not universalizable. Now, you imagine that you're in some specific situation. You have to study for an exam. You didn't, and the instructor asked you why not, and you're tempted to tell a lie and say, well, your father was sick and your mother had polio and so on, and that's why you couldn't do it. But you're an advocate of Kant's ethics, so you ask, is it universalizable? So you're tempted to lie, but you want to see if it's universalizable. So you ask yourself, could it become a principle of human behavior always for everyone to lie? To which Kant would say, no, this is literally impossible. It would be a contradiction. Why? Well, because part of the very concept of lying to someone is that the person you're speaking to accepts what you're saying as true. If everybody lied universally, they did nothing but lie all the time, every time they opened their mouth, nobody would believe anybody. Everybody would immediately attach the opposite significance to whatever anyone said. If I said to you, it's now after 9, since everyone's lying all the time, you'd simply say, he means it's not after 9. The word not would reverse its significance, you see, and you'd simply add a not into every statement that didn't have it. In other words, you couldn't lie if everybody lied. No one would believe anything. Universal lying is impossible. When you lie, you count on the fact that people generally tell the truth, and therefore you'll be believed in your particular lie. In other words, you count on the fact of being an exception to a rule that other people obey, and that's just what the categorical imperative forbids. The conclusion that Kant draws is lying as such, under any circumstances, is wrong, because the maxim or principle of lying is not universalizable. Now notice, This is a very special type of argument. He does not say, and I underscore this, if everybody lied, think what bad consequences there'd be. Think how unhappy people would be. Think of the human misery. He is not concerned with the consequences of behavior. These imperatives, remember, are justified on the grounds that they're categorical imperatives. There are certain actions which are right and others which are wrong, entirely independent of anything they lead to. Therefore, if you prove to him that if everybody lied, they'd all be miserable, he doesn't count that as an argument. But this particular argument against lying is that you simply couldn't do it. Not that if you did it, it would lead to bad consequences, but that it literally can't be done. It's impossible for everyone to lie. And therefore, lying is a sin. It's wrong. You have a duty never to lie. Now, he does the same sort of thing, or he tries to, rather. That's the most plausible example. For many other types of actions. He tries to take many commonly recognized virtues. For instance, that you should develop your talent, that you shouldn't murder other people, that you should help others. He's a strong altruist. He regards that as a virtue, and he tries to show that the alternatives in each case are not universalizable, and therefore these are required by the categorical imperative. Now, it's generally recognized that he fails dismally in this task. I'll give you just an indication on altruism, for instance. He's trying to prove, by deduction from the categorical imperative, that everyone has the moral obligation to sacrifice themselves for others, to help others, etc. He says to himself, well, now we ask, can this be universalized? Can the refusal to help others be universalized? And he says, well, yes, we'd have to grant that we could project a world in which each person lived independently, didn't sacrifice himself for other people, and didn't expect other people to sacrifice for him. But even so, even though we could project a non-altruistic world, no one could consistently will that this be a universal law. And you say, why couldn't anybody will that this be a universal law? He says, because down deep in each human being, there is the idea, someday I'm going to be in trouble and I want other people to sacrifice for me. And therefore, if I institute by my refusal to help others the rule, don't help others, I won't be able to cash in on their sacrifice for me when the time comes that I need it. Now that, you see, is a pretty hopeless attempt to deduce something from the categorical imperative, because all a person has to say is, well, I don't have the desire to be the recipient of somebody else's sacrifice. Now go and do something for me. Go and prove that by the principle of universalizability, I should help others. Since you grant that you can universalize living independently and not engaging in sacrifice. Kant can't do anything. He simply distinguishes what he calls strict and lax duty, and lax duty amounts to those cases where he wants to show that something is required by the categorical imperative but can't really do it. That's not his definition, but that's what it comes to. The main objection that philosophers raise to the universalizability principle is that it's valid as far as it goes, but that it doesn't go very far. In other words, that it's true to say that a moral principle must be universalizable if it's valid, but that's not enough. After all sorts of things are universalizable. It doesn't therefore follow that you have any obligation to do them, or that it would even be proper to do them. For instance, I could universalize quite easily the following maxim. Whenever you purchase a book, always inscribe on the flyleaf, "To Kant with love." Now, it could be universalized. There's nothing to say that the entire human race for the rest of their life couldn't do it, but you say this is ludicrous. Why in the world do it just because everybody could do it? So, in other words, it's true that a moral principle must be universalizable. That's a necessary condition, but obviously not sufficient. What we want to know is, of all the universalizable principles, which are the ones that we should act on? And this, of course, the categorical imperative does not tell us. And so the common objection is that this ethics is pretty empty of content. How would you tell Well, if you were constructing an ethics and reason, you'd have to know, well, what goal are you after? What is your concern? What do you want to achieve? And then define your principles accordingly. But of course, for Kant, all reference to goal is out, because then it's simply, if you want to achieve this goal, then, and it's hypothetical, subjective. So we have no reference to any goals, any consequences, any results, and we're left in the position of simply act on it if it's universalizable. All right, to pass to another point of great importance in his ethics, let's assume, let's grant him to continue, that he has, by judicious application of the categorical imperative, generated a whole coded set of virtues. He claims he can prove that you should never commit suicide, for instance. You should always keep promises, you should help others, etc., and so on. We have still one more major point to grasp the essence of his approach to ethics. Why should we obey the categorical imperative? Assuming now that it gives us a whole set of concrete advice, why should we obey it? And Kant's answer is, you must obey it because it is your duty. Your duty, that's the key concept. It's ordered to you by the structure of the human mind. Notice, you do not obey it because you'll achieve success, prosperity, happiness, etc. It's a categorical imperative. It doesn't say, if you want to achieve happiness, then act on universalizable principles. For all we know, it'll make us miserable to act on the categorical imperative. But that doesn't make any difference. Kant says it is your duty to act on it. You must do it because it's your duty, period. Duty is not a means to happiness. It's an end in itself, ordered to us a priori. Phrase, you see, virtue is its own reward. And he quite openly says that behaving morally may make a person miserable. If so, he says, that's just too bad. The concern of ethics is not to achieve human happiness. It's for men to do their duty. And he is particularly concerned to fight the idea that happiness is man's ultimate moral purpose. He says at one point, if the function of reason were to achieve happiness, then nature made a big mistake. Because if nature had intended man to achieve happiness, it would never have given us reason. It would have just given us instincts. Instinct, he says, is the obvious way to achieve happiness. Live on the unthinking level like the animals. They're not tortured with doubts and indecisions and agonies and choices and questionings. They just simply do, so to speak, what comes naturally and, in effect, have a laugh a minute. Now, nature did not... You see, so his argument is, if nature had intended man's reason to be a means of achieving happiness, it would have made a big mistake. Nature gave us reason, and yet reason is not an effective means of achieving happiness. Reason must have some higher, nobler end. And in fact, he says, if you look around you, you find that the more a person cultivates his reason in the attempt to find happiness, the more unhappy he becomes. That is his claimed observation of the people around him. Conclude the function of reason is not to achieve happiness. The true purpose is wholly divorced from considerations of happiness. Reason has a higher, nobler end. What is it? Obedience to the categorical imperative as an end in itself. Who then is the moral man? The man that deserves praise, moral credit. Well, it's the man who does his duty because it's his duty. The man who does what the categorical imperative dictates simply because it dictates it, without any ulterior motives. And here Kant makes a very famous and basic distinction between what he calls acting from inclination and acting from duty. Acting from inclination versus acting from duty. Acting from inclination means doing something because you want to perform that action. There's some personal goal you're seeking after. It makes you happy. It achieves some advantage, and therefore you want to take it. That's acting from inclination. acting from duty is doing something that's your duty because it's your duty, not because you have some ulterior motive, desire, goal, but simply your reverence for the categorical imperative. Now, it may be the case in a particular situation that your inclination and your duty point in the same direction. It may be the case that you want to do a certain action for personal reasons, and it happens to be the very action that your duty dictates. In such a case, says Kant, you should, of course, take the action. You still have to do your duty, but you don't get any moral credit for acting correctly in that situation, because your action is adulterated by your desire to do it. When would you get moral credit? Your action has to be not only, as he puts it, in accordance with your duty, it has to be done from the motive of duty. Now let me read you, because he is as clear on this point as anyone can be. Take the case of maintaining your life. Now, Kant thinks that by the categorical imperative he can prove that you have a duty not to commit suicide. And I'll quote him now. He says, quote, "It is a duty to maintain one's life, but in addition, everyone has also a direct inclination to do so." I interpolate, they want to remain alive, they have goals they want to achieve, etc. Continuing from Kant. "But on this account, the often anxious care which most men take for their life has no intrinsic worth, and their maxim has no moral import. They preserve their life as duty requires, no doubt, but not because duty requires. Therefore, they get no moral credit. Their action is in accordance with duty, but it's not from duty." Well, you say, when would a man get real moral credit for remaining alive? Well, Kant says, continuing the same quote, "On the other hand, if adversity and hopeless sorrow have completely taken away the relish for life, if the unfortunate one, strong in mind, indignant at his fate rather than desponding or dejected, wishes for death, and yet preserves his life without loving it, not from inclination or fear, but from duty, then his maxim has a moral worth." You get that? That's pretty clear, I think. Now, he is so thorough on this point that even on the virtue, according to him, of helping others, of altruism, you can have no inclination to it. Quote one last passage from him on this. "You have to help others strictly as a duty. If you get any pleasure, satisfaction, etc. out of it, you lose moral credit." Quote, "To be beneficent when we can is a duty. Now, there are many minds so sympathetically constituted that they find a pleasure in spreading joy around them and take delight in the satisfaction of others. But I maintain that in such a case, an action of this kind, however proper, however amiable it may be, has nevertheless no true moral worth, but is simply on a level with other inclinations. For the maxim lacks the moral import, namely that such actions be done from duty, not from inclination." Well, you say, when, for Kant, would you get credit if you sacrificed yourself and went around spreading joy for others? Well, he says, quote, "Put the case that the mind of a philanthropist were clouded by sorrow of his own, extinguishing all sympathy with the lot of others, and that while he still has the power to benefit others in distress, he is not touched by their trouble because he is absorbed with his own. And now suppose that he tears himself out of this dead insensibility." That's a typical Kantian type of phrase. He tears himself out of this dead insensibility and performs the action without any inclination to it, simply from duty. Then for the first time does his action have genuine moral worth. Now that is as unequivocally clear as one can make it. You get credit when your inclinations point in one direction and your duty in the other, and you fight your inclinations. You force yourself against your desires to do your duty. If you want to do what's right for personal reasons, you get no credit. To get moral credit on Kant's view, you have to want to do the evil and then resist temptation. Notice, therefore, for Kant, that human life, being moral, involves an inherent conflict, a struggle. It's a constant matter of resisting temptations, fighting yourself, pushing down your inclinations, sacrificing your interests, desires, in effect, effacing yourself entirely. If you don't go through this struggle of pushing down what you want, you get no moral credit. To be moral is inherently painful. Self-interest and morality are opposites. You remember Mayor Bascom in Atlas Shrugged, who said, "Lady, in this life, either you're good or you enjoy yourself, but not both." That is a disciple of Kant. Now, of course, I think it should be clear, I interject here a parenthetical comment from me. This view is the perfect perversion of the truth. On this view, the only person who gets moral credit is the man who has evil desires and then fights them. If you've achieved the state of having only virtuous desires, you get no credit. So, for instance, on this sort of view, John Galt wants to think and be rational. He doesn't have any struggle. He doesn't have any temptation in the opposite direction. He wants to. He gets no credit. Now, suppose, however, take James Taggart. He decided to reform. He went to his therapist, and he said, "Okay, I'll do it. I grant it's right." And he forces himself. Against all of his inclinations, he would much rather do his thing, so to speak, but he forces himself to think, and he sits there saying, "I'm doing my duty because it's my duty." Well, says Kant, that's the morally praiseworthy man. Now I ask you, which of those two men is in a higher moral state? I'll give you as a simpler example. Suppose you have two neighbors. Neither of them will set fire to your house. One of them has no desire to commit arson. The other one, he's living an independent, productive life, and he's perfectly happy. The other one is just wild with passion to set fire to your house. But he says to himself, "I have a duty not to commit arson, and therefore I'm going to do my duty because it's my duty," even though he can barely keep his hands off the matches. Now, who is the most moral of those two men? According to Kant, it's the one, the dutiful non-arsonist. Now, as according to objectivism, the moral man is the one who forms his desires in accordance with objective standards of self-interest, and therefore he never has a conflict between his desires and his moral standards. But the Kantian type man inherently has such a conflict. The underlying view, in effect, is that human nature is a sewer. Kant actually in one place called it radically evil, and morality consists of fighting against your evil lower nature. Now, I think the general similarities between Kant and the Christian ethics should be clear. Ethics is a matter of doing your duty. Kant, of course, was brought up as a very religious Protestant. It's a matter of commandments, although now the noumenal mind replaces God as the issuer of the commandments. It's a matter of constantly struggling against personal desires, against the problem of temptation, and the morally praiseworthy thing to do is renounce, give up, abandon your desires. Kant, in effect, is the main transmitter of the Christian doctrine of self-sacrifice on into the modern world, but in a much more extreme form than any of the Christians, or most of the Christians, had put it, because the Christians at least thought, most of them, that you could love others and enjoy the process and get some pleasure out of helping others. But for Kant to be, you get the idea, you have to do your duty because it's your duty. So that it's a much more extreme version of complete self-abnegation. This is why Miss Rand in one of her papers referred to Kant's ethics as viewing man as a shmoo, that little creature that completely effaces himself and turns into whatever you want him to be. Now we still have the climax to cap the thing, and then we're done with Kant. We have to get our means of access into the noumenal world. We start from the fact that there's a moral law. If you're giving this a title, call it God, Freedom, and Immortality, because that's Kant's famous phrase. We start from the fact that there's a moral law. Categorical imperative. We've established that. And then we're now going to show that following from the categorical imperative, we must be able to find out something about the noumenal world. Now, I know you're going to tell me that it was supposed to be unknowable, but it turns out, as you'll see, that we can sort of know something after all. What can we know? Or sort of know? Well, if there's a moral law, we must be able to obey it. Morality requires free will. If we didn't have free choice, if we were completely determined, if we couldn't act any differently than we actually did, then of course there would be no point in telling us what we ought to do. The famous line, ought implies can. A man is leaping out the window, and on his way down you call out to him, you shouldn't fall. It's no use telling me I can't do anything else. In other words, morality presupposes free will, free choice. We know there's morality, therefore we know there must be free choice. But where will we find free choice? Well, we find it in the phenomenal world. Well, says Kant, no, can't find any free choice in the phenomenal world. Because the phenomenal world, remember, is governed by the causality mechanism. And as Kant interprets it, if every event has a cause, and the cause has a cause, and the cause has a cause, and so on all the way back, that everything that happens in the phenomenal world is strictly determined, and within the phenomenal world, nothing could have happened differently. In other words, he equates cause and effect with determinism, with the denial of free will. If you have any questions as to what's wrong with that, I'll be glad to discuss that point in the question period. But it's a very common equation, the assumption that cause and effect means the obliteration of free will. So we're in this situation, there must be free will, but we can't find it in the phenomenal world governed by causality. Where then? Well, where else but in the noumenal world? There must then be a real self, our self in itself, in the noumenal world, which makes real choices, which is really free, and which is therefore responsible for our actions here in this world. Because if it wasn't so, we couldn't have morality. So the solution to the age-old controversy of free will versus determinism is that they apply to different worlds. Determinism is true of the phenomenal world, and free will is true of the noumenal world. Now, of course, if you ask me, what is this real self? That's unknowable. If you ask me, how does it produce our phenomenal actions? That's unknowable. In fact, if you ask me, can we really understand this point, I would say no, and so would Kant. Now wait, so would Kant. Take this case. A man robs a bank. That takes place in the phenomenal world, you see. Now, says Kant, the robbery as it appears to us, the phenomenal robbery, is inevitable, because it's part of the structure of cause and effect, and everything in the phenomenal world is determined. But in itself, it didn't have to take place, because it was chosen by our real selves in the noumenal world. Now, you might think, well, if it was chosen by our real selves in the noumenal world and they're free, then it didn't have to take place. But, and then you might think, if our real selves in the noumenal world had chosen differently, then it wouldn't take place. But of course we can't say that, because the phenomenal robbery had to take place no matter what happens in the noumenal world, because everything in the phenomenal world is entirely determined. So we're in this position that somehow there is a free will in the noumenal world, which is somehow allows us to hold ourselves responsible for what we do in the phenomenal world, even though everything in the phenomenal world couldn't possibly have happened differently from the way it did, and even if the noumenal self had acted differently, the phenomenal self would still go on doing what it did. Now you say this is incomprehensible? Kant says the same thing. But he says that's no objection, because we understand why it's incomprehensible. It's incomprehensible because it pertains to the noumenal world, and that is inconceivable. And therefore, the most we can do with the problem of free will and determinism is, no, we must have free will, but how we have it and how it relates to the way we operate here, we've at least proved that we can't grasp the answer to that question. So much for freedom in that phrase, God, freedom, and immortality. Freedom in that phrase means free will. Now, I barefacedly add that much as Kant inveighs against happiness as the good or as the goal of life, he also says that the highest state of affairs would be the one in which a virtuous man achieved happiness. He says this on a different page. And that is, of course, a gross contradiction in my view. In any event, the very best possible state of affairs would be if a virtuous man were to achieve happiness. But, he says, here on earth, virtue does not lead to happiness. The wicked prosper, the virtuous suffer. To which I add parenthetically, that's because they follow Kant's ethics, but I'll leave that point out. In any event, he concludes, if justice is to triumph, if the virtuous are to get their just rewards and the evil their just punishment, there must be an afterlife where the moral scales are evened up, where the good are rewarded and the bad punished, and that, of course, presupposes that our noumenal self somehow survives the death of the phenomenal body, and that there is, and therefore immortality, and that there is some kind of supreme moral being who is awarding out the praise and blame, punishment and reward for our phenomenal performances. And that entity is, of course, God. Therefore, starting from morality, we can reach not only free will, but God and immortality. Now, of course, God and immortality are also noumenal. They're outside of any experience. We can't know what they are, but we're entitled to have faith in them. Not knowledge, says Kant, but faith. But he quickly says, not an arbitrary faith, because I've just shown you how they follow from morality. So as I've heard it put, it's an a priori faith. And now we've achieved, in effect, the capstone of the whole procedure, because we have saved religion from the onslaughts of the skeptics and the atheists. Every time prior to Kant, a religion has tried to get off the ground and put forth some argument for God, he was smashed by an atheist showing him all the fallacies in his argument. Kant claims now he has saved religion, saved God, immortality, etc., once and for all from the assaults of reason, because he's shown that this is simply a matter of faith that reason can't touch, reason having no access to the noumenal world. He says in the critique, I have found it necessary to limit knowledge in order to make room for faith. I've, in effect, put reason in its place. And he says, if anybody accuses me of coming to simply negative results, we can't know reality, I'll answer that I have the same function as a policeman. The criminal, in this case, being reason. I've put it in its place, I've kept it in the phenomenal world, and the door is now open for faith in the noumenal world. Why isn't it universalizable to commit suicide? The consequences are unfortunate, but Kant isn't supposed to be considering consequences, is he? No, he isn't. I'll give you one of his forms of trying to prove that suicide is not universalizable. It occurs in his attempt to reformulate the categorical imperative to make it applicable to social situations. What should your attitude be to human beings? And he there formulates what he calls the principle of humanity as an end in itself, according to which we must always treat every human being, whether in our own person or any other, always as an end, never as a means. This, he says, is alone universalizable, because if you tried to treat everybody as a means, then the question would be, means to what? Means to somebody's end, and you would be following a non-universal principle. You'd be treating some people as means to the others who are ends. Since that's not universalizable and you couldn't treat everyone as a means, it must follow that the only way to universalizable conduct is to treat everybody as an end. Now that includes yourself. Now, says Kant, what would be your motive for committing suicide? Well, let's suppose you're miserable, you're unhappy, you find life intolerable, and you say, I am going to take my life. Well, you are, says Kant, in that case, treating yourself as a means to an end, instead of an end in itself. You're treating yourself as a means to I think his exact words, if I remember, are as a means to a tolerable state of life. And you're not supposed to treat any human being, including yourself, as simply a means to an end. And therefore, taking your life because you're not happy would be making yourself a means to an end, namely happy. And that, of course, is wrong. You are to obey the categorical imperative because it's there. And the fact that you're miserable does not have anything to do with it. And therefore, in effect, simply to be rational is an end in itself, regardless of the consequences. And irrationality means not concerning yourself with consequences, but following the categorical imperative. Therefore, you shouldn't aim at happiness, and if you're not happy, he claims it follows you shouldn't commit suicide. That's the best I can do with suicide. If one is an end in himself, not a means, then why should one help others? If one did help others, he would in fact make himself a means to an end. Therefore, why didn't Kant consider selfishness a virtue? Well, that's because when he says that man is an end in himself, he doesn't mean anything remotely like what an objectivist would mean when he says each man is an end in himself. When an objectivist says each man is an end in himself, he means morality is a series of principles telling you how to achieve a certain end, namely your own life, welfare, happiness. And each man has a right to pursue his own life without interfering with others. That whole interpretation of man as an end in himself rests upon a completely different type of ethics, what Kant would call a hypothetical type of ethics. It rests upon the idea of setting up a goal of value and justifying actions on the grounds that they lead to it. And then objectivism adds that each man has a right to that goal for himself, and none should interfere with others, and therefore you should neither sacrifice yourself for others nor others for yourself. When Kant says man is an end in himself, he doesn't say it in any such context at all. He means, actually, adherence to reason, as he interprets it, is an end in itself. In other words, morally that would mean doing your duty is an end in itself, regardless of its consequences. And this means you must regard each man as an end in himself only in the sense of you must let him do his duty and mustn't interfere with his right to be rational, as Kant construes it, which means to do his duty, as Kant construes it. But one of those duties is that you should sacrifice yourself for others. And consequently, he would never derive selfishness out of his structure. The question implies a completely different view of what it means to say man is an end in himself. Selfishness, Kant invades against constantly, because selfishness implies you've got a goal that you want to achieve, and you're out to gain it, and that you justify your actions because of their results, because of something you want. Well, of course, that's acting from inclination. That's ignoring fact that you should act from duty, that's ignoring the categorical imperative, etc., and that is out. If all the categories make us think in a certain way and no other way, does Kant make an exception with the categorical imperative giving man a choice? No. He would say that the recognition that the categorical imperative is true is universal, and that you could get anyone, if he was honest, to confess, if he read Kant, that acting on universalizable principles is his moral obligation. In this sense, he thinks that the validity of the categorical imperative is universal, necessary, and no one who really thinks about morality could come to any conclusion other than the categorical imperative, just as he would say no one who thinks about the question of causality could come to any conclusion other than cause and effect. Of course, there are people who have denied cause and effect, like David Hume, but Kant would say he's counting upon it even when he denies it. And he would say the same thing with people who deny the categorical imperative. The difference, however, is that since the categorical imperative is a practical phenomenon, it governs how we should act, and he believes we have free choice, you have a choice as to whether to obey that or not, whether you're going to live up to it, in effect, or indulge your inclinations. So your area of choice, you do have an area of choice here that you don't on the theoretical level. You have no choice but to think in terms of the categories. You have a choice as to whether to obey the categorical imperative, but no choice as to whether to agree that it's true. In effect, you have a choice to be immoral, but no choice as to what morality consists of. I didn't follow your explanation of how Kant gets from morality to the existence of an afterlife and God. Is it simply because morality does not lead to happiness on earth? The best combination would be virtue and happiness, and therefore they must exist somewhere, and then where does God come from? Well, essentially, yes. He says, morality, being virtuous, doesn't lead to happiness here on earth. But it should. Our sense of justice tells us that it would only be right if virtuous men were happy. Of course, here on earth, they're miserable. Therefore, there must be another dimension to even up the moral scales, where moral men get their just rewards, and that implies that they're immortal and can inhabit this dimension. And there must be some supreme moral judge who's passing out the rewards and punishments, and that's where God comes in. Now, if you say, where does he come from? I don't know, because that's numinal, but that's where he comes in. So it's called a moral argument for God, you see, rather than a metaphysical. He isn't trying to show that by the nature of reality there must be a God, but by the nature of man's moral sense, we can have faith that there is a supreme being who will satisfy our moral aspirations. Last week, in answer to a question, you said that since the noumenal world is unknowable, one couldn't say if similar things in the phenomenal world corresponded to similar things in themselves in the noumenal world. When Kant speaks of a noumenal soul corresponding to a phenomenal soul, isn't he doing just this? Yes, he is. And of course, what can I say except he cannot speak about the noumenal world on his philosophy. So even his excursion via faith into the noumenal world is a violation of his philosophy. He would hasten to add, of course, he doesn't know what he means by a noumenal self in itself. He can't even think of it as existing, as one, as an entity, as subject to causality, as anything. But what can I do? When someone introduces the unknowable and then claims a means of access to it, all I can do as a presenter is present what he thought he had access to, and when you then say, but he said it was unknowable, I say, yeah, that's right, but he left that part out when he got to the next part and tried to cover it by saying it was a matter of faith.